Mehreen, take us back to last week when there was a political earthquake in America. Just describe what happened.
Yeah, I think probably a political earthquake centered very much on New York City. And that's because Zohran Mamdani, a 33-year-old democratic socialist, self-identified, beat Andrew Cuomo, who comes from one of the dynasties of New York politics. He beat Andrew Cuomo in a primary election and against all odds came from basically nowhere to become what people are hailing as the fresh new face of the Democratic Party. And by winning that primary, he set himself up as the Democrats' candidate for the New York City mayoral election, which is happening this November. Very much pole position to become the first South Asian, first Muslim, and I think the youngest mayor in New York City's history for at least 100 years. So there's a lot of precedents that are going to be broken if indeed he does get the job.
Just explain why that was such a shock.
Well, I guess like a lot of listeners and most people who opened up their newspapers on Wednesday or Thursday last week, Zohran Mamdani is not a face or a name that they knew. He's not a member of the Democratic Party's sort of establishment. Of course, it's a New York City race, so there's no need for people outside New York City to know who mayoral candidates are. But New York City is such an important city for Democrats, and obviously it's the beating heart of Wall Street. It is the home of corporate America to some degree. New York City mayors are actually international politicians. So the fact that this guy is going to be in the running for the party, the Democrats that often win this race, means that he's effectively on a one-way course to becoming one of the most important Democratic Party politicians. Even more importantly, in the first sort of major election since the presidential election in 2024. So, it's a big political moment because of where America is right now under the Trump administration. And as probably we're going to chat about, it might tell us a little bit about where the Democratic Party's future is going to lie electorally in the age of Trump.
I mean, it was a particularly unlikely victory because, you mentioned that New York is obviously the home of corporate America. There was a lot of money behind the other candidates.
There was. I mentioned Andrew Cuomo before, and he was the recognizable name. People in New York know the Cuomos through his father. He had a lot of name recognition. Cuomo has a sort of incumbency advantage. He's not the sitting mayor, but he has the kind of all the name recognition that when people vote in New York City, because of the rank system, they're going to vote for the guy whose name they recognize, Andrew Cuomo, despite, lots of sort of stories and allegations around his misconduct in office before.
His opponents brought up his dozen-plus sexual harassment allegations, for which he says he's both apologized and has denied.
The people who don't feel safe are young women, mothers and grandmothers around Andrew Cuomo. That's the greatest threat to public safety.
The fact that Mamdani's come from, effectively, it feels like nowhere, to DC Cuomo, who actually had to sort of step down. He said that he wasn't going to run when it looked like the polling showed that Mamdani was going to win. It seems that first-time voters, a lot of early voting has really pushed him over the line. And yeah, now we're all talking about him, which I guess is why I'm here.
It is a remarkable campaign, and we want to hear more about him. And thank God you're an aficionado, so we'll talk about him in a moment.
I think I'm a stalker at this point, but sometimes it comes
Mehreen,
in
I
handy.
wasn't going to say it, but thank God we've got one on staff. But just before we do, just tell us a bit about, what are his big policies? You mentioned that he's a democratic socialist. That's quite unusual in the Democratic Party these days. What are some of the policies he wants to introduce? What's his manifesto for New York?
I think that one of the other reasons that I really became a little bit invested in this campaign was because how much of it is actually dominated by economic policy. And I don't think that's been a norm for lots of Democrats, and I don't think that's been a norm in US politics, which of course everyone has seen has become dominated by issues of identity and culture. So the Mamdani campaign was entirely focused on a couple of big themes. I think the biggest is affordability for working class New Yorkers, and then offshoots of that are things like housing, transport, childcare provision. And that's why I think it's interesting to understand this as a potential blueprint for what Democrats could do in the future, because one of the biggest, I think, failings potentially of the Biden administration and then the Kamala campaign was this accusation that they were not focused enough on cost of living, on the material pressures facing American voters, and strayed too much into the sort of signaling about saving democracy or, being good, progressive, liberal people. Sometimes it's called wokeism. And that's sort of one of the things that people think that Biden failed at. And so now you have this new generation, he literally quite is the new generation of the Democrats, doing a super cost of living focused campaign. And, again, so, the economics correspondent in me is sort of interested in to see what this guy's coming up with and whether it's going to stick with voters. And initially, the answer seems to be yes.
Yeah, I mean, it seems to be very popular with voters. You know, the ideas like rent freezes in New York, where property prices and rents are out of control, are obviously hugely popular. They're not necessarily popular within the Democratic Party, though. I mean, as an economist, what's the consensus on policies like that?
Sure, let's go through some of them. So you mentioned rent freezes in existing rent control buildings, of which New York City has. It has housing or apartments which are already under some form of rent control, and Mamdani wants to have an actual freeze, so they don't even rise in line or below inflation, they stay where they are. The other one is building of homes, so he's got a target of 200,000 new home builds, also under rent controls over the next 10 years. It's a pretty modest target, but again, very much clear focus on affordable housing. He has slightly, I think, kookier ideas, like maybe the state should own grocery shops, so a few state-run grocery shops where people can buy their food at wholesale prices. This is not necessarily to, take over American grocery chains, but a few of these bodega-type grocery shops that Americans use all the time. I mentioned things like the halal cart, which is a very specific New York City thing, which is a food truck where you can buy basically rice and chicken or rice and meat. He had this fantastic couple of videos of him talking to halal food cart owners, asking them why they've had to raise their prices. And this is basically a question about where they're allowed to pitch their food trucks and rents, free childcare, free buses, raising corporation tax, taxing billionaires. This is all, I mean, in some sense, not really very revolutionary, but because we haven't heard Democratic Party politicians really hone in on issues of cost of living for, I think, probably since Bernie Sanders, it did feel pretty refreshing. And of course, it's centered around the inhabitants of New York City, which he's won. So I think it had an immediate direct resonance with the kind of people he wanted to come out to vote, in contrast with Andrew Cuomo, who I think was this sort of pretty distant, patrician sort of figure that perhaps was just sort of relying on his name recognition and his previous accolades to sort of get him through the campaign. So when you watch them in debates, there was just a clear identity and a strategy that Mamdani had.
Donald Trump would go through Mr. Mamdani like a hot knife through butter. He's been in government 27 minutes. He passed 3 bills. That's all he's done. He has no experience with Washington, no experience in New York City. He would be Trump's delight.
All right, brief response, Mr. Mamdani, then we have to move on.
Look, it's true that I don't have experience with corrupt Trump billionaires who are funding my campaign. I don't have experience with party politics and insider consultants.
And, I mean, the policies that you've named, things like free childcare, free buses, would be popular in any big city, I suspect. How does he plan to fund those? That's always the question. Is it just by taxing the wealthy?
Pretty much. He wants to raise New York City's income tax to match that of New Jersey, to raise extra few billions of pounds. I think his free bus plan, he's costed at something like $700 million, which he says something can be raised through increasing income tax. He wants to increase income tax on people who earn more than $1 million a year. And in that sense, this is pretty standard leftist economics. I think it's an incredibly simple in many ways message, and it stood out so much because so few, I think, of politicians in the Democratic Party are willing to just really commit to what he calls democratic socialism. I would say is sort of a tax and welfare policy that is centered around public utilities, the supply of housing, the supply of transport, the welfare state, things which perhaps some of us in Europe take for granted, but in America are truly quite revolutionary ideas.
And as you said, a lot of first-time voters were coming out. Is this a generational thing?
Potentially, but not exclusively. I think his appeal is very much about working class, middle class New Yorkers. And from the data that we've seen, he does seem to have a reasonable spread across geographic and ethnic lines in New York around people in that sort of socioeconomic bracket. And when you have a message that is focused really on the material stuff and less on the identity stuff, I think he proves that that's probably a pretty healthy way for the Democrats to go, especially if you believe the critique that the Democrats have really lost sight of the sort of material conditions of people.